Hello A&P students, my name is Eric Barn, and today I'm going to be taking you guys through a short activity about your cranial bones. So, in your lab section, you dropped a model of the skull and it exploded into all the different cranial bones. While your lab instructor isn't looking, you need to quickly identify each bone and put the skull back together before your lab instructor looks. Alright, so these are the first two bones that you're going to come across. These are actually the same bone, so I'll pause right here and give you guys a second to guess the bone. Okay, so these are going to be our parietal bones. And how do we know that? Because in the picture, they form sort of a downward U. If you guys can see my mouse right here, it forms a downward U that's going to encase the top of the skull. And that's how we know they're the parietal bones. These are going to be two of the most superior bones in your skull. Now the next bone you find is going to be this bone right here. So if you read the hint, there are two of these bones in the skull, although only one of them is shown. So on the left here, we have a lateral view, and then on the right side here, we have a medial view. So I will give you guys a second to guess the bone. Okay, so this is going to be our temporal bone. And how do we know it's the temporal bone? So if we look on the left here, the two easy bony processes to point out here are the zygomatic process right here, and then the mastoid process right here. And these are always going to be on the lateral side of the bone. So we can also identify this as a right temporal bone. If we're a left temporal bone, the zygomatic process would have to be on the other side. And these, in comparison to the parietal bones, are going to be inferior. So when we're putting our skull back together, these are going to have to be inferior to your parietal bones. Then this is the next bone you find. So I will give you guys a second to guess this one. Okay, so this is going to be our sphenoid bone. And how do I know it's the sphenoid bone? Because if we look at the right here, you can kind of see that sella turcica, or the Turkish chair, which is a feature of the sphenoid bone. Now it's important here to determine the anterior side and the posterior side. And how do we know which side the posterior side is? Again, if we look at that sella turcica, it will always be on the posterior aspect of the sphenoid. So the image on the right will be the posterior view, and the image on the left will be the anterior view. And this bone is going to be just anterior to our parietal bones, and it will run in the frontal plane right in front of your parietal bones. So the next bone we find is going to be this bone, and I'll give you guys a hint that there's only one of these in the skull. So I'll give you guys a second to guess the bone really quick. Okay, so this is going to be our occipital bone. And how do I know this? Because if we look at this big hole in the bone right here, this is going to be the foramen magnum, and that's going to be where the spinal cord exits the skull. And that's how we know this is the occipital bone. And where is this going to be located on the skull? It's going to be on the very posterior aspect. So it's going to articulate with those parietal bones from earlier, and it's going to be at the very posterior aspect of the skull. Then the next bone you pick up is this one, and I'll give you guys another hint. There's only one of these in the skull, so I'll give you guys another second to guess this one. Okay, so this is going to be our frontal bone. And how do I know that? Because if we look right here and right here, you can see the superior outline of the orbits, or the eye sockets. And you can also see the nasal bones would be right about here, and they would articulate with the frontal bone. So where is the frontal bone in the skull? It's going to be towards the very anterior part of the skull, and I remember that because frontal is towards the front. Now the next bones we're going to come across are these two. So if we look at the hint, this is a picture of two bones that articulate with each other. So if we look at the picture, we have this as one bone and this as another. So I'll give you guys a second to answer and try to guess this bone. Alright, so this bone right here is going to be called the zygomatic bone. And how do we know that? Because if you look right here, this process is going to be articulating with the zygomatic process from the temporal bone. And that's how I like to remember that this is the zygomatic bone. And this is going to be articulating with this bone right here which is called the maxilla. And how do we know this is the maxilla? So if you look right here, the maxilla is going to be forming some of the wall of the orbit or eye socket. Also, if you look here, it's going to be forming a little bit of the nose. And then if you can't determine that it's the maxilla from those two features, you can also look here at the holes where teeth would be, and that's also how we can determine that this is the maxilla. So now this is the last bone that you find and have to add to the skull. So I'll give you guys just a second to guess this bone. So this bone right here is going to be our mandible. And how do we know this? So if you look at these two bony processes, we're going to have the coronoid process here and the condyle right here. And if you can't identify it from those bony processes, you can also look here at the holes where teeth would be. And that's also how you can identify this is the mandible. And this bone is also going to be anterior and inferior to the bones in your skull. So hopefully now we have a completed skull that we've made now. So thank you for your time and have a great week.